Hey adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. I'm a partner at Simpatico Studios, where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience of your professional peers on simpatico.tv. I'm building a new type of online community for professionals like yourself on the Climate Adaptation channel. If you're a regular listener of my America Adapts podcast, I think you'll find that we're taking our conversations about important problems, policies, and solutions to the next level here. And if you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now join us for this latest episode. Hey adapters, welcome back. Our guest today is Anna Weber of the Natural Resources Defense Council. As a member of NRDC's Water and Climate team, Anna researches and advocates for policies that advance equitable climate adaptation. She works to incorporate the current and future effects of climate-driven hazards into government decision-making and ensure that adaptation policies benefit those on the front lines of climate change. Anna will discuss the extent of repeated flooding around the U.S. She explores why repeatedly flooded properties are growing in number and the connection between environmental racism, housing policy, and flood risk, while discussing mitigation strategies and their challenges. She familiarizes us with NRDC's Losing Ground data dashboard, its limitations, and other flood-related datasets. Hey, Anna, welcome to the show.
Hi, it's great to be here.
All right, so you are calling, well, we have you coming in from the DC area, right?
Yes, that's right.
All right, well, it's a crazy day there. We don't need to go into that, but
Yeah.
what an odd start to the new year. But here we are, we're going to talk flooding. We'll stay focused on that. So we've had someone on from NRDC before. You work with them, Rob, more. But could you give background again on what is NRDC?
Sure. So NRDC is an international environmental nonprofit. Our area in NRDC, the Water and Climate team, which is where Rob and I work, is a small team within the institution that focuses specifically on adaptation policy and all of the things that are associated with it. So policies that address how the U.S. recovers from disasters, prepares for disasters, and most importantly, tries to reduce the risk of future disaster damage and harm to people.
Okay, and so what's your specific role there?
So I'm a policy analyst, and my role is basically, like as it says, to conduct analyses that inform evidence-based policy. So for example, and we're going to be talking about our Losing Ground dashboard in a little bit, this is an example of a project where we take data and sort of crunch it and make it accessible to the public so that local decision makers, interested members of the public, members of Congress, others in NRDC, the list goes on, can use that information to make good decisions and learn more about these issues that are affecting us all across the country.
All right, so before we jump into some of these specific policy recommendations and these tools that you have, could you maybe give a more broad overview of just even the issue of flooding in the United States? I think people don't realize how complicated it really is when it comes to what it means for disaster management and all that. And maybe just a sort of a 30,000-foot view of what the sort of the flooding situation is. And, I'll let you just go anywhere you want with that. That's such a broad question, but I think it's good to give some broader context to things.
Yeah, that is a really broad question because flooding affects so many aspects of life all around the country. And I'll just focus on the US, but obviously this is a global issue. Even if you don't take into account climate change, flooding is still one of the most widespread and damaging types of natural hazards, and accounts for a very large percent of the disaster damages and injuries and deaths that we see around the country. And then when we add in climate change, we're sort of getting an increase in flooding risk in two ways. One, because of sea level rise. And so the coast, the high tide is actually coming in towards the land. And on the other hand, we're also seeing increased precipitation, rainfall in a lot of areas. And so especially coupled with the ways that we've made development happen across the US, and we can talk about that lately. This sort of trifecta of sea level rise, land use and development and increased rainfall is really increasing flood risk in a lot of areas. And that's a huge problem. This is a place where we are seeing the effects of climate change today, right now. And it is affecting people's lives and homes and livelihoods. And that's scary. It's because it's only going to get worse. But the good news is that there's a lot of things that we can do to address flood risk. And we can talk about some of those later if you want.
Okay, I think of the shop that you're in with Rob, and it's like the movie Groundhog Day when you think about flooding insurance and reform. Oh, you're building there again. You're building there again, and yeah, it must be frustrating in that respect. All right, on that note, let's dig into this. And so this term here, it's actually a new term for me, is severe repetitive loss property. I mean, that'd be a good starting off point to talk about some of the things that you're doing there. What does that really mean?
Yeah, so like most things when it comes to flood insurance, or maybe even insurance in general, there's a really complicated term that refers to something that's very technical, but when you zoom out a little bit and think about it, it's very natural. It's an easy concept to think about. So severe repetitive loss property is basically just what it says it is. This is a property that's insured under the National Flood Insurance Program, and it has experienced severe and repetitive flooding over its lifetime. So there are many properties that are covered under the National Flood Insurance Program that have flooded once or maybe twice. And that's obviously a problem because nobody wants to be flooded. But there's also this subset of properties that have flooded 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 20 times over the life of the building. And these properties are categorized by the flood insurance program under this banner of severe repetitive loss. And categorizing them this way both helps us see where repetitive flooding is happening. We can count these properties and see where they are located. And it also should help us prioritize areas that should get mitigation assistance to do things like elevate a home, or maybe give the residents a buyout so that they can move someplace safer.
Okay, so I've heard about these homes that are flooded repeatedly, and I'm just like, okay, how do they get rebuilt? And how, you've mentioned even 10 times. The private insurance markets, they're not the ones giving them insurance anymore, right? That they're just too high risk. It's just the National Flood Insurance Program that's sort of obligated to give insurance to these homes.
Yeah, that's right. That's the purpose of the National Flood Insurance Program, or one of its purposes, at least. It exists because the private insurance market back in the 60s didn't want to insure flood risk because they saw it as a losing financial proposition. So the federal government stepped in and created the National Flood Insurance Program, and its goal is to provide insurance in this area of the market where regular homeowner insurance companies, for example, weren't providing insurance. The flip side of that is that the National Flood Insurance Program, in addition to just selling insurance, is supposed to be acting to reduce everybody's flood risk by providing funding for mitigation, for incentivizing communities to make different decisions about their development by setting codes and standards that towns and cities are supposed to comply with in order to be able to get flood insurance policies. But at the end of the day, flood losses are just increasing and increasing, and mitigation to reduce that risk isn't really keeping up.
Okay, so even with some of the reforms, I know there's always recommendations to change it in big ways, but are homes that have been flooded the fifth, sixth, 10th time still happening? Or, I mean, or have they corrected that? Is that still happening? Like they'll
That is that is absolutely still happening. Rob, who you've talked to on this show before, likes to talk about this sort of cycle of flooding and rebuilding and repeating. And sadly, that's where a lot of people are sort of just trapped in this cycle of their home is flooded. If they're lucky enough to have flood insurance, insurance will cover the damages so that they can build back to where they were before. But that doesn't help you very much. I mean, if you think about another kind of insurance, like say car insurance, that model makes more sense because if you get rear-ended by a truck, that's a terrible day. but your insurance kicks in and you can repair your car. And because you got rear-ended by a truck one time, hopefully that means it's not going to happen to you again. It was just bad luck that day. But if your home is flooded, that's a pretty good sign that there's flood risk at your location, and you're likely to flood again and again if you don't take steps to reduce that risk. Unfortunately, the way that insurance works most of the time is it only brings you back to where you were before instead of going that extra step to try and reduce risk for next time.
Okay, so these severe repetitive loss properties, there's a database of these. They're tracked. People see these things. And you had mentioned part of the strategy of the flood insurance program is to work with communities to try to prevent, I don't know, building back in these areas or mitigating against these things. And so if a home's showing up multiple times, isn't that such a red flag of saying this community is doing something wrong? Because it's probably not just one home in that area. Usually when there's a flooding event, it's multiple homes in a given flood zone. And that in no way does that trigger sort of, I guess, wiser decisions?
I mean, that's exactly why we've published this losing ground data dashboard. So this data set, which is a list of all the severe repetitive loss properties under the National Insurance Program, National Flood Insurance Program, has never been made public before, as far as we know. We requested it through a Freedom of Information Act request from FEMA a couple of years ago and obtained the data set. And we've now put it out online so that everyone can see it. But until now, it's not something that you could just go and look up how many severe repetitive loss properties are in your town. Even if you were working in, say, the land use department of the county government, it may be hard for you to access this information because it's pretty closely held by the federal government. And so now is the first time that you actually can go and look up your state or your county on our tool and say, wow, this is surprising. There's so much more repetitive flooding in this area than I thought. What is my local government doing about it? What is the state doing about it? What can we do differently as a whole system across levels of government and individual residents as well to try and address this problem?
Well, I applaud you. I didn't realize that was a story that you guys got access to that information because when I was first thinking about it, I'm just like, gosh, they want to hide this information. And I'm sure the homeowner too doesn't want to be sort of called out like, look at all this, not that you want to pick on them, but you don't want these bad decisions to keep being made. But on that note, you've referred to it many times now, the losing ground data set. Could you just sort of explain everything that you're trying to do with that and maybe even visualize that? Is it sort of a website that you go and it's a dashboard, or what is it?
Yeah, exactly. So this is an interactive mapping tool. You can access it on our website, nrdc.org, if you just look up losing ground on our website. And we've loaded into it this data set of all the severe repetitive loss properties, not just the ones that are currently insured under the federal flood insurance program, but also ones that were sort of previously on the severe repetitive list and have now been mitigated. They've had some action taken to reduce their risk. So you can see which areas are doing more mitigation than others on these properties. And you can also look for properties that used to be insured under the flood insurance program and qualified to get on the severe repetitive loss list and now are no longer insured. And this is something that was a surprise when we started looking at the data set, how many of these there are. So these are properties that, as far as we know, are still at risk of repetitive flooding, but the homeowner has dropped out of the flood insurance program for whatever reason. And so, as far as we know, these residents are completely unprotected from flood damages. We've also included in our tool some sort of background data from the National Flood Insurance Program itself, of the sort of full universe of flood insurance claims. So you can look and see for a particular county, say, well, there are a lot of flood insurance claims, but very few repetitively flooded properties, and compare it to another location that has a lot of flood insurance claims, but a lot of repetitively flooded properties. And you can think about what local land use or floodplain management decisions might be contributing to that difference.
That's very interesting. It's really getting you to start thinking about it differently, just the tying those different pieces of information together. And so I guess my question, you guys are using it, but who else is using it? Are you finding it local governments, other organizations who's using this data set?
So that's been a really exciting part of this project. So in addition to the data dashboard, which, like I said, allows you to search at the state or county level, just to give you a sort of broad overview, The data set itself has a lot more information in it. We only showed sort of the tip of the iceberg in our tool. So anyone can go and download the spreadsheet that is exactly the same as the spreadsheet that we got from FEMA that has all 36,774 records for all of the severe repetitive loss properties as of mid-2018. And you can go in and look at the characteristics of the properties themselves. There's some more detailed geographical information. You can look up the town or the zip code, and then you can do your own analyses. So one of the things that is so important about this flood risk data, I think, is to understand who the people are and the communities who are being affected by this flooding, because as we all know, flood risk is not evenly distributed amongst different types of communities and different types of residents. And so you can, for example, compare the trends in severe repetitive loss property and in property mitigation to the demographics of an area. Is mitigation funding mostly being used in whiter, wealthier areas in your county? Is it going to lower income communities, communities of color? These are really important questions, and this data set is sort of another piece in the puzzle to help us understand this issue and also to start addressing it.
Okay, so I got a question from the community room. Ken's asks, wait, are residents notified that their home is classified as a repetitive risk, or do they have to seek that info out? Oh, interesting. So do they get a red flag for it?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it should be an easy answer, right? It should be like, of course you would know if your home is on this list. But it's actually surprisingly difficult to get information from the National Flood Insurance Program, even if it's about your own home that you own. And this gets into another issue that our colleague Joel Scatta on our team at NRDC has looked a lot into, about disclosure and transparency of flood insurance data. So if you currently hold a flood insurance policy under the National Flood Insurance Program, you can contact the program and get information about sort of the history of the policy that's been on your home. But if you don't currently hold a policy, it's really difficult to get information about your property, even if you own it and have lived there for a long time. And that makes sense. You know, you think about privacy reasons why the federal government doesn't want to just be like giving out people, information about people's homes. But on the other hand, we hear story after story about people who don't know that their home is at risk of flooding until it floods. And then they try to get flood insurance and realize that there's been a history of repeated floods on the property.
All right, so this notion of equity and access to these funds, and I thought that it's a big issue, and I'm just curious of what you find. Do you spend more of your time dealing with issues of coastal flooding? Because when I think of flooding, I typically think of rivers and the areas in the floodplains, and that's where you typically see a lot of flooding. Most of the time when it's coastal, it's like, oh, it's a hurricane, and you're going to get this sort of one-time event. And then this notion of equity in disaster assistance, that I would imagine the coastal flooding, when that occurs, a lot of probably more wealthier people are impacted because they're the ones who can afford to have these homes on the beaches and on coastal areas. Whereas when it comes to maybe in inland areas where you have flooding in rivers and such, that you could have all economic classes along that. What are you kind of seeing there? Because you're making a point that it's sort of uneven access to this, and who's being impacted by flooding events. Is it almost like two hats that you have to wear when you're dealing with like flooding issues in these two different geographic zones?
I think you've hit on something really important, which is when people think about flooding and flood insurance, they often think about like a millionaire's beach house on the coast, right? And they think, why should our tax dollars go to support their, risky decision? And of course, those homes do exist and they do experience flooding, but they're a pretty small proportion of homes that are at risk from flooding and homes that are covered by the National Flood Insurance Program in general. The flood insurance program has a maximum amount that it will pay, that it will cover, basically. And so a multi-million-dollar property is going to need some sort of supplemental insurance, because the National Flood Insurance Program is not going to pay to replace an entire, multi-million-dollar home. On the other hand, even when you are dealing with flood events at the coast, it's not just the fancy beachfront properties that are affected. There is so much flooding that occurs in the slightly inland or the back bay neighborhoods of these coastal areas, which are usually much more affordable and have long-standing communities that have been living there for generations, and they're just as at risk as the big fancy houses on the beach. And so I think regardless of whether it's inland flooding or coastal flooding, you see a very wide swath of American families that are affected by the risk itself. But then, of course, when it comes to who has access to the assistance and the resources to reduce that risk or to rebuild after a disaster, that's where you really get to see these equity issues, which is just such an important question. There is so much that's connected in this area to the just US's history of segregated housing development and disinvestment in neighborhoods of color. And we see that shine through really strongly when we look at data about who's affected by flooding and what the long-term effects of those floods are on communities.
Okay, got another question from Ken here is what is your number one policy recommendation to address the problems of severe repetitive flood properties?
So it's hard to pick one
Okay.
because like any good problem, it's complicated and there's a range of solutions that we need to have them all at the same time. So I guess comprehensive flood insurance reform, perhaps, but that covers a lot of different angles. One of the things that we definitely need to be doing is prioritizing pre-disaster mitigation. So doing things to the built environment and our communities and just sort of like our systems and institutions to make us sit in a better place so that when the next flood comes, we aren't as affected as badly. And in a flood context, again, that's things like elevating a home or raising up the utilities or offering buyouts or putting in green infrastructure to reduce stormwater flooding, things like that. But at the same time, we also need to be looking at these building codes and the land use decisions that are sort of putting people in harm's way in the first place. We have so much flood risk right now from climate change and is only growing. And at the same time, there is still explosive development in risky areas across the country. And there are very limited standards that prevent this kind of building in flood prone areas. And then sort of the third pillar of this strategy, I guess, comes back to the transparency and disclosure requirements, like we were talking about, so that people actually understand their flood risk and can make good decisions for their own families based on the best information.
Okay, so we're going to get to the end of the episode here, but I do want to ask this, and I feel like sometimes I get different answers when I've had this conversation before, is that you have a home that's repeatedly flooded, and let's say that person wants to move away, but they can't necessarily afford to do it. And if you think of all the disaster assistance that's out there, what's really happening in that scenario?
So normally what happens in that scenario, to be frank, is nothing. Nothing happens. The person rebuilds what they can and is facing the next flood. There's very limited assistance available for most people in these situations. That's not to say that there isn't any, and there's a long history going back several decades in the US of offering buyouts to people who are affected by disasters, particularly flooding. This is a technique that was first used really broadly after the Great Mississippi Flood of 1983. And there were a lot of communities that offered buyouts to their residents, including some towns that just relocated entire neighborhoods to higher ground. NRDC put out a report a couple of years ago called Going Under, which looks at the sort of the history of buyouts and how they work in the US. But it's a really long, complicated process to get a buyout. There's a lot of sort of logistics and red tape that go into it because there's a lot of different funding decisions that are made at different levels of government. So even if you want to leave your repeatedly flooded home, there aren't a lot of options available to you, which is really terrible. And that's something that NRDC is also advocating for to help make this process better and help have more options actually available and accessible to people who need to make this decision.
I think there's sort of implied that if funding was available, the people would move out of these areas. But I'm just curious if even that's true. Has NRDC or has anyone sort of done survey work, or you're talking to people in these flood zones that have had these repetitively flooded homes? Do they even really want to move? Like, you know what? I'll take that money and just rebuild. Is that the majority of them, or do the majority want to move if given the option and it's not so difficult? Is any data out there that sort of gets inside the minds of people living in these flood zones?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of really interesting sort of sociological research that looks at people's decision-making processes, in these situations, because it's just hard to think about uprooting your family and moving and leaving your home. It's such an emotional decision. It's financially complicated. It's logistically complicated. Um, but what I think the research shows is that it really depends on the community. There are some communities where people are fighting for buyouts. They're showing up to City Hall with signs that literally say, "Buy us out." And then there are other communities where they want to stay and make it work for as long as they can. And I think that this really has to be a community decision. Um, so often after a disaster, communities don't get to make their own choices about how they want to move forward. Um, and I think that's something that if we're going to even hope to have an equitable climate adaptation strategy in this country, it has to be about self-determination at the community level.
Okay, so we're at the end of the episode, and just to wrap up, what's next for you? What do your next 6 months or like a year look like besides dealing with COVID and being housebound?
Well, one thing about flooding and disaster policy is that it is always a topic that is in the news, and it is always something where there's something going on. With the new Congress and the new administration, we have a lot of advocacy planned to hope to see some good strides forward towards smarter adaptation policies. And we hope that this year has fewer disasters than last year, but we'll see. And hopefully, the policies that we're working towards will make us all more ready to deal with them as a country.
Okay, Anna, this has been great, very informative, and again, it's a treat to chat with you for the first time. I want to take you into just chatting just to close out the episode, but hopefully we'll get you on again. There's so many topics to discuss around this, and maybe there's a check-in that we can do on the progress that the Biden administration's been making. But appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks a lot.
All right, hold on. We're going to go into just chatting.